Welcome, all listeners, for another episode of Too Cool for the Comic Shop. I am one of your hosts, Eric Zavinski, and here today I'm joined by.
I'm Maureen Crowley.
Todd Crawford.
Very good. And we are going to be discussing Dune as a topical topic because the new film, Dune Part 1, just came out in theaters this fall, 2021. And it might devolve into some discussions about past adaptations and also the original novel by Frank Herbert, published, I believe, in 1965. And here, I guess we will kick off by me saying that this was my first exposure to the franchise, is with this Denis Villeneuve 2021 film. I specifically kept myself celibate until this film because I wanted to just have a cinematic experience where I didn't really know too much of what to expect. And one of the fun elements of this experience was that Maureen, you had visited us, me and my husband, just recently, and we watched it all together for the first time.
Yeah, it was pretty fun. Weirdly enough, you mentioned like your first experience with like the franchise being this movie. My first experience was like years ago. Like Family Guy, there was like a cutaway scene of like Peter sticking his hand in the box, and that's just what I remember. But for real though, I didn't know too much about like Dune or anything going into it. I just the first Dune movie I've seen was when I went and saw it with you guys in the theaters and stuff when Dylan and I came to visit you all. And yeah, and then last night I watched 1984, and then this morning I watched Jodorowsky's Dune. And they were all pretty interesting.
Read 1984. I have not seen any adaptation of it, though.
I had never read Dune. I'd intended to for a long time. But it's one of those books you tell yourself, oh yeah, I'll read that eventually, and you don't. Because it's really long, it's got a ton of sequels, and it seems like crazy bullshit. Yeah. And I had seen Jodorowsky's Dune just because I was a fan of the director, but I don't really consider that like, it's almost an interesting piece of Dune trivia. I wouldn't consider in any way an adaptation or really even tethered to it. It just happens to involve Dune. But I did watch Lynch's Dune last night just out of curiosity because I don't have time to read the book, just for another interpretation of the material, even though that one was, of course, famously heavily compromised and kind of a bastardized version.
Yeah, and it was pretty unfortunate. I know I actually watched Dune last night too, and I think I was like an hour behind you, Todd. I was watching it like kind of by myself, and it just, when you go through it, you're just like, oh man, the studio completely like butchered this. And I guess like David Lynch's version was supposed to be like 5 hours long, but the studio cut it into 2 hours, and like they were really not generous with that, which is really unfortunate because I feel like in that adaptation there were like so many things I really liked about it. And anyway, I'm getting like a little bit distracted, but like it's interesting to see like how all three interpretations of like the source material are, and I have some like opinions on that I can get into later on. But seeing Jodorowsky like attempt it first in the 70s, then Lynch gets hired on in the 80s, and then we haven't seen like a new Dune movie. I think we saw like Frank Herbert's like 2000 Dune or something, and the Children of Dune, but I didn't get invested in any of those. But like this is like the first like serious adaptation in 2021, and I mean, personally I was really excited about it, but I know we all have like different opinions on that. But I guess, do we want to get into it, like see what you guys think?
We can start with Todd because Maureen, you and I saw it together and had, I think, similar opinions.
Yeah, so I don't know. My experience with this movie is I had no business watching it. I had no intention or interest in watching it. You know, how I see it, the older I get, is that your relationship with film, I think that we see it as a democracy these days, which is interesting. Where like geek stuff, like the stuff we typically discuss on this program, we want, like the MCU, for instance, we want Captain America to pick up Thor's hammer like it's hinted at in Age of Ultron. And if it doesn't, we riot. If Daryl dies, we riot. we determine, we're the audience, we're the paying customer, we decide what happens. And some directors, like for instance, like Stanley Kubrick, who I think we'll probably end up bringing up in this discussion, he sees it as a fascist kind of dictatorship where he's telling everybody what to do. He can abuse people, he can act tyrannically because it's all about his vision. And that's what you would call an auteur. And how I typically see art is more like a relationship. It doesn't have to be romantic or anything, but essentially you're having a communication with the artistic product, right? So you're bringing your input as a viewer and your own personal taste, and then the artist's vision is meeting you kind of halfway, and you're having discussion with it. And essentially, my opinions on Denis Villeneuve, I believe it's pronounced, is you go on a first date with someone, it goes okay. You know, you're not in love or anything. And then you go on a second, and you're not happy. You go on a third, you're not happy. A fourth, you're not happy. And eventually, it's your fault for continuing to go on dates with this person you're not interested in, you're not attracted to. And so that's really my thoughts on Dune. But I went in, and I said, you know, I'll watch it. It's a different movie. I mean, there's a lot of directors that made movies I don't like and then get better. There's many actors that have one great performance, you know, and I did enjoy Prisoners quite a bit, but I don't like the cast of this movie all that much. I have no relationship with Dune, and I dislike, I will say now I am just like a hater of Villeneuve. I will openly say I think he is a hack, but essentially, yeah, this movie convinced me of a new artistic term I never thought of called a fauteur. So you have the auteurs, like Kubrick, for instance, and then faux, which fake, obviously. And he's kind of this weird middle ground of trying to be an auteur, but yet also being kind of a hired gun, getting attached to these big studio properties, which is totally fine. I'm not criticizing that. That's, in many ways, that could even be a compliment. That's not like an insult. It's just an awkward middle ground for a lot of these projects. And this one, to me, the thing that I took away from it the most was just the soullessness of it. The way that you have world building in your films. I talked about this in Blade Runner, how I didn't like the minimalist approach to many of the landscapes. And the way that he directs is world sucking. It takes the character out of these actors that are otherwise good. I mean, I really like Oscar Isaac. I like Jason Momoa quite a bit. I like what's his name? Thanos. And
Josh Brolin.
I'm sorry, what? Yeah, thank you.
Josh Brolin.
And the way that he depicts this world, especially after seeing Lynch's Dune, which is a failure, it's an abortion of a movie, but it has character, it's entertaining, it's interesting. I see the merit in this world now. Seeing his depiction of it to me is just, and I don't mean joyless as in like there's not MCU quips. There is humor in the movie. Not much, but it's there. But it's such a flatline affair that I really thought, like, maybe I just don't like Dune. There's just nothing here that's interesting. And the way the world is shot is so hack, where every different location's one color. The Dune's orange. That makes sense, of course. The Lynch's version's even worse with that. But, like, this helicopter's green. This room's all brown. And it's just, it doesn't look lived in at all. I think it's a huge step back in terms of sci-fi cinematography. I think Timothée Chalamet gives one of the worst performances in a Hollywood lead in a long time. And, I mean, I didn't like the movie, and there wasn't much of a chance I was going to like it. I liked it less than I thought I would, but really I just think it's mediocrity incarnate.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like what you're saying, and thank you for sharing. I think, like, I think, what was the director's name? Denis
Villeneuve.
Denis Villeneuve. Like, he kind of succeeded where Lynch and Zavinski failed. Like, he was able to take Dune's like runtime from 2 hours and able to make like a 3-hour movie plus do another movie. Because I remember David Lynch like wanted to do like a second movie, and that was like one of the only things he could sign on. The studio like completely just like they were horrible to him, and it's really unfortunate. And it's interesting too. It's like, I don't know if you guys like look too far into it, but like looking and seeing what Denis has to say about the prior Dunes and seeing what David Lynch and his name Zavinski have to say about like each other's movies, and it's kind of interesting. Like, I know David Lynch was saying he just had no interest in Dune whatsoever, and imagining like his like harrowing experience with it, I can imagine like it was just like a time of heartache, and he just wanted nothing to do with it. And what interested me the most though was Zavinski said that he's like when he saw David Lynch's Dune, he was so happy it was a failure. Like he was just so happy it was a terrible movie because like his movie didn't get the green light, and he was just like, there's so much bitterness around like these directors. It's kind of insane. It's kind of like early like surrealism almost. Like everyone was just out after each other in some degree, but like, but at the same time he um, wished like he did the bigger man thing and said he hopes like 2021 Dune's a success. But it was cool. He actually got to review the trailer, and he said like a lot of what you're saying, Todd, is that the movie as a whole is just industrial cinema, and it was very like predictable and kind of like soulless. Like I found an article here. I'll just read a snippet of it. But he said, "I saw the trailer, and it was very well done. We can see that it's industrial cinema, and there was a lot of money, and that it was very expensive. But it was very expensive. It must pay in proportion." And that's the problem. There are no surprises. The form is identical to what is being done everywhere. The shape of it, the lighting, the acting is all predictable. And industrial cinema is incompatible with auteur cinema. For the former, money comes before. For the second, it's the opposite. Whatever the quality of the director, whether my friend Nicholas, Refn, or Denis Villeneuve, industrial cinema promotes entertainment. It is a show that is not intended to change humanity or society, which is kind of interesting. I think in some ways it kind of aligns with what you're saying.
I just want to say I was unaware of that interview. I feel like a total jerk now. Because now I feel like I just stole that. But that's funny.
That is funny. Yeah, because I was like, I just found that today, and I was like, that sounds like something Todd would say.
Meanwhile, if you like look at like my browser history, it's like bookmarked.
Cool. But Eric, what do you think?
I think it's interesting that all this discussion about industrial filmmaking and how it has no soul. When I saw some of the interviews with Denis, who is definitely one of my favorite directors working today.
Yeah.
Completely polar opposite to Todd in that regard. I think Denis made some of the most amazing films that are also popular in the past decade. Look at Arrival and Blade Runner 2049 and now Dune. I think, on the whole, they are mostly positively received, but also have some sort of substance to them. And there's one thing that I saw that the director said is that it's almost kind of like an auteur comment, in the sense that he wanted to make a film that only he was happy with, and if other people were happy with it, then so be it. So that came from the director's mouth, and I felt that kind of resonated. That's how I like to make art. That's how I want to write. I'm not going to write it for any other audience other than myself. And then if other people happen to like it as well, then that's kind of a positive thing, I guess. So coming from the director, I think that is kind of a cool way to look at things. But I was part of that audience that really resonated with the film. It's probably my favorite movie I've seen in theaters in the past few years, to be honest. So, yep, totally polar opposite of the spectrum there.
Yeah, and honestly, just as a side note, I would like to, in the description below, link the article I found just so people can reference it. But, I mean, for me personally, I didn't know anything going into the movie. And part of the reason I wanted to see the movie in the first place was, like, because I know, Eric, you were interested in going, and it just so coincided that the movie was going to be showing at the theater near where you lived when we came to visit. And also Timothée Chalamet, let's be real. Like, he's like 80% of the reason I wanted to see that movie. But for me personally, it was a solid 10, like, as a movie. But then again, I'm a different kind of viewer, and I like sort of prioritize like things differently with like what I personally see as a viewer. And again, all those things are subjective. And for me, my like must-haves are like, good aesthetics, like sight and sound. Like I think Hans Zimmer was recruited to do like the score for the movie, which I really enjoyed. Um, Aesthetically, I really liked it. I did kind of personally enjoy the monochromatic look. Like I know, Todd, that you'd mentioned, like, Dune is obviously one color. I think for me, it helped like differentiate between like where we were at, like world wise and, sort of geographically. Because I think if you have like, I mean, you could have title cards at the bottom of every like screen, everything to signify location change. But I think it's sometimes changes in color can be like a very good subtle indicator of like scene change and location change without actually having to like state to the viewer like painfully like here's where we are now and stuff like that. But personally for me, I really do like a lot of monochromatic stuff and like a lot of like muted tone stuff, but again, that's not for everybody, which I get. And another thing I really enjoyed is how seamless, or at least to me, how tight the story was given what it was. Like if my other priority is just having a good plausible story, like for me all the details like contributed to the larger whole of the movie. Detail was like woven very organically into the movie. Like I don't want to like play this comparison game, but like between like Dune 1984 and 2021, like 1984 had a lot of voiceover stuff. It was like mostly voiceover, very little situations of people interacting and having like moments of like, intimacy or character building together. And again, not David Lynch's fault in any capacity. The reason that movie flopped was not his fault. But I think, 2021 succeeded in certain aspects the way that the initial one failed, or that specific rendition failed. And another thing I really and with that comes like a lot of emotional resonance. One scene that kind of strikes me in particular in Dune 2021 when Jessica and the Duke are sort of in bed together getting ready, for turning in for the night. And he says, he's kind of like laying with his head in her lap and says like, I wish I would have married you. And I thought that was just kind of like a very sweet, intimate moment. I almost felt like I was kind of intrusive on it, but it was just such a tender kind of scene that I really liked. And, 1984, it was just like the Duke coming down the stairs, like thinking it in his head. Whereas like, it's kind of interesting to see how like two different directors sort of like, interpret that kind of moment. But, and just like there's a lot more like emotionally resonant aspects. But again, just because I like it, just because I like something, doesn't make it good. I get that like Dune 2021 can be flawed in a lot of ways, and it is kind of like industrial. It doesn't really contribute anything new to like the sci-fi genre as a whole. But I mean, I really enjoyed it. It was the first movie I've been excited about in a very long time. I think I actually went and saw this movie twice in theaters, and I keep offering to go with people all the time. I'm like, hey, if you guys want to see Dune, I'll go with you guys to theaters again. It was like the first movie I've been really excited about, honestly, since 2010. And it's like when Inception came out, I think, is 2010. And that was like the movie I saw, I think, like 3 or 4 times in theaters when it first came out. And looking back, I'm like, this movie was not that great. But like, and I'm sure I'll probably feel the same way about Dune in the future, but I hope not. But I don't know. I think and it does like call into question when you think about what Jodorowsky was saying about, I'm sorry if I keep saying his name wrong, but it's kind of interesting to see what he prioritizes in a movie versus what Denis kind of looking at, like, what is the function of a movie? Is it to like escape? Is it entertainment? Is it purely like an artistic high level endeavor? Is it meant to like inform, like educate, moralize? Like, I guess it really just depends on the different audiences who are going to be interested in that kind of movie. Like, to your point, Eric, you're saying like writing for yourself, and maybe other people will be interested in it too. Like, and I kind of am inclined to agree with that. I don't think either one of these adaptations would have been perfect. I actually hear a lot of different polarizing things from fans. Like, a lot of people say like the new Dune is kind of like not great, and then you hear like David Lynch's version is not great either. Then you hear like, the 1970s Dune is also not that great, because they're like, Jodorowsky never even read Dune. Like, no one working on the production of that film ever read that book. But I guess that calls into question like what the purpose of the movie is, and each director's artistic vision again. But
I'm glad you brought up the emotional resonance of it, because it made me pull up. I would texted a friend who he hates Villeneuve. He's like a very liberal kind of progressive dude, and he was talking to me about Sicario, which I thought was an okay movie. I liked it. I didn't love it. I just emotionally didn't resonate with it, but like I think it's a good movie. But he hated it, and he was texting me when he watched it. But I sent him a review of Dune. I call it Dunk online because that just differentiates it without putting the year, because the logo looks like a C for the E, which is kind of silly. But I said watching Dunk now. Sorry, I'm looking for the relevant part. Never read the book, but the way the story is presented is so uninteresting and dull. Has Villeneuve ever been in love? Does he understand human emotions? He made a Women Don't Belong in the Workplace movie with Sicario and an incel movie with Blade Runner 2049. This is one of the driest, in a bad way, movies I've seen in a long time. I don't think he's capable of feeling. Makes Nolan look like a bleeding heart by comparison. Which I want to bring that up because you mentioned the emotions and Nolan, so I just thought it was kind of funny. But shit, I'm trying to think now. I lost my train of thought.
that is interesting.
Oh,
'Cause it's
yes. Sorry, I know I was the one who talked about cutting off, but I got my thought back. The one thing I want to bring up with like the thoughts thing, I know we talked about this yesterday, is that, and I understand what you're saying with the thoughts, it is cheesy and lame. And I'm not like defending the original Dune. I think it's an interesting movie. I actually think it's an okay movie. I don't think it's a good movie, but it's not a bad movie, I don't think. I love Jodorowsky's perspective. It's very funny, but I don't think it's like a laughably mad movie. It's a laughably weird movie. But I think that this movie suffers just as much in almost every line of dialogue. I just think that instead of doing a weird choice of having thoughts, it's just expository dialogue all the time, where the characters are feeding you information that you as a viewer need to do, which is very Nolan-esque, which I typically don't have an issue with. I just didn't connect with it, which you could say that part is a viewer thing. I understand that part, but there's a point in the movie that really made me laugh where a character locks a door and then another character says the door is locked and spells it out for the audience. And at the end of the movie, Mary Jane says, like, this is just the beginning, so the audience knows to be back in theaters in a few years. And I think this film really suffered from not just that, like, it's a long movie with a lot of story. I get you have to spoon feed a lot of information. I mean, I'm not saying, like, if I wrote it, it would be this eloquent, poetic thing. But every line of dialogue is spoken, and this is a personal thing, with this kind of, like, I hate period piece movies a lot of the time. I like some. I like The Favorite, which I think I saw with you, Maureen. But I'd hate the thing in a lot of... That was a fun time. But I don't like in period pieces when every single thing said has this kind of gravitas, so that actually when everything has gravitas in dialogue, nothing does. And it's just that for a whole fucking movie. It's me personally. Like, some people don't like jazz. I don't like that.
Yeah, no, I get where you're coming from. And Dylan kind of had a thought on like this whole like everyone sounds stuffy and uppity. And now he writes a lot of like D&D, and he is very like immersed in that kind of stuff, and he watches like a lot of that like D&D content, and he's willing personally to give it a pass, because he's like, when you have nobility and you have all that, like, people are pretty stuffy and pretty uppity, that's just part of nobility. And he was like, it kind of contrasts like with like Duncan Idaho, who's a little more like in Dune 2021. I mean, like, he's a little more like easygoing and like very like more casual, because it like serves as like kind of contrast. But I can see where you're coming from. Like, the one thing that did bother me about like the end of Dune 2021 was just like Zendaya's just like, and now just begun. I'm like, son of a bitch, I didn't need you to spell that out for me like that. Like, my gosh. But like, I think it could have just ended, like, I really wish the last line was just like when Timothée Chalamet just says, if you'll have us, we'll come, and then just goes from there. And then she just looks at him like she does in in his visions, and then just the movie ends. I think that I would have been okay with that. But I mean, for me, it's like so inconsequential that I guess it's not really a huge bother to me. But I guess like in 1984, it was just very much like there was like lock the door every scene. It was like Kyle MacLachlan having like dreams and he's just saying what the images are out loud, or people saying like, I remember the scene where they're with the doctor, and Paul and Duke Leto were all in, the craft, and they're trying to rescue the guys from before the sandworm comes and gets them. And literally in 1984, the doctor just like, he cares more about his men than he does the spice. And it's like, I know, based on the way he looked at him when he said that, I know. I didn't need that spelled out for you. This is not like My Hero Academia where you replay the same scene 5 times in an episode to save on footage. But no, for real, I get where you're coming from. And I think historical pieces are really tough. Even just world building in general is just really, really hard. And also you have to consider like the source material of Dune, because like Dune in and of itself is like, how many books are there? Like there are so many. And that's just the crazy part of adaptation. It's like, how much of the source material do you actually use? But I could go off on a tangent about that, but I just figured if you guys have any other thoughts on that, I'll start there.
Oh yeah, I think I want to add a couple different responses to some of the things that have been said recently. Is that the first one was, does this add anything to the sci-fi genre? I think that's kind of a trick question, right? Because, you could look at it in this very clinical view where it's like, oh, does the adaptation of this story add anything? And I think it should be viewed a little bit more holistically. So say, for instance, that me and Maureen, for example, and my husband for that matter, ever read Dune in the past, a passing interest, but never picked it up, kind of like you did, Todd. You just never picked it up. If a film adaptation encourages interest in the original story that is widely regarded to be super influential in the sci-fi spectrum, and I think it already has contributed. Maybe it is not contributing fully on its own merits, but it can't fully contribute on its own merits because it is by nature an adaptation. So I think in that regard, it has objectively contributed a lot, this 2021 adaptation, because
Okay, that's
now,
bullshit. I'm sorry, that's silly.
okay,
I see where you're coming
explain
from.
how it's bullshit.
Because, okay, so that's like saying if someone molests a kid, the kid grows up to be a counselor for other children that have trauma, therefore it was a good thing. And I get what you're saying with the book and all that, and I agree with your point, but the end thing's just a bit of a cognitive dissonance.
But this adaptation actually tried to adapt the source material. My brother's actually read the book, unlike the rest of us. He said Dune Part 1 was basically beat for beat the first 300 pages of that first novel, exactly what we got in the movie. So, Todd, you brought up earlier, maybe you just don't like Dune. I think that's probably really likely at this point. If people who have read the book said it's a really adaptation, and definitely way closer than anything we've gotten so far.
And I see that point, and a lot of Dune fans agree. That is one thing I've seen from a lot of my friends who generally are lukewarm on the movie. They like Dune, so they like seeing it adapted. And here's my qualm with your assertion, to say it's objectively contributed. And I see your point where, like, if someone watches it, let's say Troll, for instance, the John Carl Buechler movie. It's a bad movie. I love it. If that gets someone into fantasy movies, if because a character's name's Harry Potter in it, that they go and watch Harry Potter because the main character of the movie is named Harry Potter for some reason, that could be a positive effect, of course. I just think it's kind of silly to say it's objectively made like this historical impact on merit of being an adaptation. But it gets its spot on the Wikipedia page on Dune, of course, of doing it because it's affiliated. In terms of being an adaptation, that being a barometer for quality, it just depends on what kind of a viewer you are. I mean, if you want to watch a movie to get the book brought to screen, then you could view it that way. I think The Shining might be the best Stephen King adaptation. And it's not really an adaptation. And that's fine. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about if the movie's good or enjoyable for you or not. But at the end of the day, it's its own product. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are two different ways you can adapt something too. I mean, you can adapt something, word for word, chapter for chapter, and you can adapt something to try to achieve the same spirit or the same something, same subject matter or same substance. Which I think The Shining is like an interesting example of that, where The Shining definitely strays on the details quite a bit. I think there is some sort of the same spirit being adapted, if that makes any sense.
I think it does, but to be honest, I've never read The Shining, and I don't want to. And that's no disrespect to
I mean,
Stephen
I've never
King
read it either,
at
but I
all.
know that it's different enough that people who have read it are like, "Oh, yeah, it's definitely a different experience."
Exactly. Same with Jaws. Like, I love Jaws. I like Peter Benchley as a writer. I will never read the book Jaws because I love the movie too much. And that's just me.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to take in consideration when it comes to um, like adapting anything really. But I think to Eric, to your point, I do understand where you're coming from. Where if it gets people interested into the genre, I think that that is a contribution in and of itself. I think it really just depends on what we constitute as like a contribution to the genre. Like, do you mean like as a whole? Would that mean generating interest for the source material or into like a genre or a specific director or a specific type of movies mode of storytelling? Is it like something like abstraction, meaning you're trying to do something that no one's done before? Because I think if that's what a lot of people are meaning by like doing something new for the genre, that's like almost that's pretty hard, to really find something that's like no one's ever done this before. Because I'm like, odds are it probably has been done before. But I think as far as doing adaptations, I think a lot of the success of the adaptation depends on the quality of the source material and creative freedom from like if we're talking movies, like creative freedom from like studio intervention and the director viewing themselves as an artist, like the director as an artist. It's like the three directors who did these movies, they're all artists. Like, we all may have like varying feelings about their work, but just because we like or dislike something, just because we like something doesn't make it good, and just because we dislike it doesn't make it bad or like disqualified as art. I mean, like, and again, going back to like quality of source material, not all things translate well to the screen. And sometimes it takes like the director making the decision on how, if they're doing an adaptation, how to do it, because you can either like, directly transcribe. I mean, that's something like that could be fan service for a lot of people, but at the expense of sacrificing the flow of the film and runtime, you run into like budget issues, like a lot of what, David Lynch ran into when he was doing 1984. There's also do you try to meet somewhere in the middle? Like big examples like Lord of the Rings. Like, it was pretty expansive. They did 3 movies based on each book, and I know a lot of people really hate the franchise, but a lot of people like me like very much really well love the franchise. And I mean, it took like creative liberties with like some of the material, but it did really balance like leaning into the source material with swapping details like out to like serve better film flows. So they kind of like I said, met in the middle. Or does a director just disregard the source material entirely, like Kubrick did in The Shining?
Well, I think I'm trying to think how to put it because it's a weird example, like a weird comparison. But I think with some people, it's tough. And this isn't a criticism of any of the movies. I think it's impossible to reach expectations. And this kind of goes back into like my dating comparison earlier, where it's like, if you go and expect to meet your soulmate and you're, the biggest hunk of your life or whatever, it's unfair to the person you're going to meet because they're a real person. And similarly, with something, so here's my comparison with something I am familiar with more. The Sopranos recently, The Many Saints of Newark came out. I personally enjoyed it. I don't think it's a great movie. I had fun watching it. Even if it was a standalone movie, it wouldn't be great, but I had a fun time watching with my friend, who's also a big Sopranos fan. I think a lot of people, well, there's many valid criticisms, I can't lie, but there's a lot of people who saw it and basically thought, well, Sopranos is like, to many people, I don't know if it's the consensus or whatever, it doesn't much matter, but many people say it's the best TV show of all time in terms of quality, or at least a contender. And Many Saints of Newark, even for the people, those of us who did enjoy it, it is so far from the best movie of all time. but it's hard to separate those expectations. And I think any adaptation of Dune has and always will have this expectation that, oh, this is an adaptation of one of the most influential sci-fi books of all time. Therefore, it has to be one of the best science fiction films ever. It has to change the genre.
Right.
And once again, that's not a criticism of any of them. It's just it's really just a bad, unfortunate, unfair position for any director to be in my personal opinion.
Right. No, I understand where you're coming from. And I think too, like, it's an extra challenge because you're trying to adapt like a multi-book franchise, and it's like, do you have the liberty to make one movie for each book like they did Lord of the Rings? Or I know some movies have like condensed like several books into one. I think like Beautiful Creatures, I think it was a YA series that was condensed into one shitty movie. Series of Unfortunate Events, 13 books condensed into one shitty movie. Then you have Master and Commander, a 21 book series that was condensed into one okay movie. And then you have some series like the Chronicles of Narnia that were like only half the series was done because they figured, only half the series was done because they figured that no one else would give a shit about it after a while. So it's like, at what point where does like Dune fit?
I just
That
want to
makes
say,
a lot of
I'm
sense.
sorry, Eric.
Sorry, I just feel like I did a lot of talking. Sorry.
I think one of the opinions I have on that is that typically if you're looking for a more fleshed out story experience, you're going to read the book, right? And so how I kind of grew up, say, watching Harry Potter, for example. I watched the Harry Potter movies before I ever read the books. The early movies were when I was really young and probably wouldn't have read them anyway. And then as I got older and the movies kept coming out, I just kept seeing the movies. And then eventually I did read all of the books. And for me personally, that was a very fulfilling experience because I already liked the movies well enough. Then the books I kind of enjoyed even more, but because I had that movie baseline experience that I know I enjoyed it, that's kind of the same experience that I wanted to have with Dune because I didn't want to read Dune first and then feel like potentially I was going to be missing out on certain things that I may have really liked in the book in the movie. So I purposefully did not like myself have the book expectations going into watching this movie. That was like a personal strategy. But now I'm going to read the book because I'm very interested, which means the second half of the book will be foreseeably what will be the second movie. So I will have expectations for part two when it comes out in a couple years, but it's at least how I wanted to start going in to watch this film.
See, I'm going to say two things real quick. First of all, when you have that edition, you got that edition of the first Dune book that had the blue pages. I'm really jealous of that. I'm going to say that right now. It looked really bad.
It is sexy.
And the second thing is, I know you said I suggested just stop reading halfway through until the second movie comes out. Like, I mean, that's still an option. Also, there's Dune fan fiction, guys. Like, it's a real thing, and it's pretty great.
Did you send the passage to Todd that you sent me the other day?
Oh no, I think I just told him about it when I saw Todd on Saturday, Sunday, and I just told him about it then. But it's pretty great. So many crossovers between like Dune and the Avengers, and it has nothing to do with Dune, or it's just retelling of like the first act of Dune 2021, only with Naruto characters. I feel like it's satisfying my urge for like reading Dune without spoiling it for myself. So I think I might just do that for a while.
That's what you'll be doing.
Some second books or some second half of the book spoilers are going to leak in there somehow, though. But you're not going to have any context for it. It's going to be like, oh, Iron Man from the Avengers and Leonardo from the Ninja Turtles ended up killing Chani. Oh no.
Yeah. See, the way I see it is like, if I do end up running into any spoilers, I won't be able to believe if it's real or not. Like you said, like it, because I'm like, is this author making it up? Did Donatello really come in and like decapitate somebody? We don't know. Like, I'm willing to suspend disbelief for a while.
You're gonna be so disappointed because you're gonna be in the theater and you'll be like, "What the fuck? Amelia Earhart isn't even in this."
I know, right?
I talk about inflated expectations.
Yeah. Gosh, it gives me bad vibes back to 47 Meters Down when I got on Facebook and Todd like wrote like and a status post about like, is that what they call it? A status post, like about the ending of the movie, and that was why I went to go watch the movie. And when that didn't happen, like the way Todd said it was on Facebook, I was really offended.
I wouldn't believe Todd said anything truthful. That's where you went wrong.
Oh, I was like super on board with like, oh, the island natives like caught them, or like someone like they got fed to sharks. Like, okay, I'll watch that. But no, it was a terrible, mediocre movie. Anyway, um, yeah. But I think you guys do bring up some good points about like source material. I feel like that was like something we really talked. Now, I haven't read the books at all, and I know it's something I would like to do, you know, one day when I have a more of a time commitment, but like less time commitments. But I think it can be really hard to adapt that kind of stuff from book to screen, because a lot of it too is like fan service and seeing, you know, people who are huge fans of the book want to see it on screen. Because I know a lot of people who were fans of Dune did enjoy the David Lynch version, and they enjoyed like seeing a lot of the elements of the movie, like visually and some of the story. But I know with all the studio interference, it left them much to be desired. But I think too, Todd, I think at one point you brought up a really good question, like if Dune is even good movie material. I think that was you. Either that or someone else, but
it was me. And now that you've seen Jodorowsky's Dune, you might know more what I was referring to, with how a lot of the potential for that just kind of like went out into the world with all these different projects and defined science fiction essentially as we know it. Ironically, Dune is almost the most influential science fiction film, but it's just the ghost of Jodorowsky's Dune. And I also have a theory that potentially there will never be a great Dune adaptation that satisfies everyone. Speaking only for like the fans and all that, like the people that you know grew up with it, or whatever, the nerds as they like to be called, I think. That it's because Jodorowsky's movies haunting all of them, and that's why the productions have been cursed. Like we're gonna find on this version that like you know some spooky stuff happened on set, and maybe you know a poltergeist type situation.
Timothy Chalamet was possessed for like 10 days. No, I'm kidding. See, what I found interesting was I watched the ending of like Jodorowsky's Dune, and it like really, it made me, you know, it honestly made me cry, because it was cool to see that he and the artist, I can't remember his name, actually took all of his notes. It was like over 3,000 drawings they made for this like movie. It was like this, the movie was runtime was could be anywhere from like 10 to 12, but I think it got up to 14 hours. Like I saw like the screenplay he had. It was like literally like a very, very thick book. It was like the thickest like, you know, stack of paper I'd ever seen in my lifetime. And but it was really cool to see that he and the artist got together and they actually released it and made a comic book using all of that art. And it was very interesting to see the director say, even though the project failed and never got off the ground, to see like his, you know, sort of fingerprints all over various like pop culture movies like Star Wars. I think there was even influence in the Raiders of the Lost Ark and a lot of other, you know, movies still ever influenced, because like all the people who worked on that project, and when it disbanded, like they just went on, worked on different movies, and they brought all of their ideas into those movies. So it's like he's still always there, like you said, very much like a ghost. And it's unique too, because he, you know, Browski said, even though the project failed, like it just meant for him, he doesn't feel like he failed. It was more so just a change in direction. And that's when he released that comic. And he said to himself that he's like 84 years old. And he's like, when I die, someone can take this and adapt it. And, you know, he still very much would like to see it happen. But it was just a very interesting thing. And even too, like he was saying that he was very obsessed with like this movie coming out. Like one of his quotes was like that for him, Dune would be like the coming of a god. And like, which is very interesting considering like a lot of like aspects of the book talk about it's like a franchise that is so like focused on like this Messiah character. Like Paul in some ways is this kind of like Messiah God character, and how Jodorowsky was really just interpreting that almost as like the movie becoming this god that influences the mind of the next generation is just very interesting.
See, going back to what you said when you were talking about what I said with Dune being unadaptable, I mean, I do think I've heard this a lot that maybe it should have been an HBO Max series or something rather than a movie. And I do wonder because, like, I mean, it's being split into multiple movies, and that seems like a very good decision for many reasons.
Right.
I don't know that I found. Well, I personally did not. I'll put it that way. I personally did not find the first half to be a satisfactory cinematic experience. But I think that where they cut it, seeing Lynch's version, if that, for instance, was a trilogy or something, and they cut it at the same moment roughly,
Right.
it probably would have made. I mean, it would need buffed out or whatever, but I see that angle making multiple movies. But I just, yeah, like the book being like 1,000 pages, having all this stuff. I do wonder if the mini-series format or something like Game of Thrones or whatever, because there's so many books, and I think most of them are supposed to be bad. I don't really know. I hear they seem like guilty pleasures or something. I have no knowledge of it, but I would think that a long form show, or I had said maybe an animated series would work better, something that could be more stylized. Because I mean, I'm no director or anything, but if I was personally like approached with this, I wouldn't know what the fuck to do. Like, you have to make a giant worm look cool.
Yeah. Right.
People with blue eyes.
Looks like that there's also a graphic novel adaptation in the works, so I don't think it's like out yet. So maybe that will also satiate the adaptation fix people might have, but in a different way.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And I think as far as adaptation, it doesn't always have to be a movie. Like I'm curious to see like the different forms. Like, I'm always interested to see how different projects go. Um, like I said with Jodorowsky, where they took all his 3,000 drawings and just made a comic book out of it, and it's pretty rad. And I think in the Jodorowsky's Dune documentary, they did suggest making it like an animated movie, and I'm just like, I don't know. To me personally, like I don't know if it'd be like as much of an epic if it was animated, but again, I guess like due to cost constraints, like you could make a 14-hour animation, and I feel like it'd probably be maybe a little more cost effective than trying to do like props for like a 14-hour like live action thing. But I don't know. Like I'd be curious to see if that ever came about. But again, I think a lot of it has to do with like source material because I don't really think all all books make good movies. Um, but I do think in some cases, like a lot of books do make great movies. But I guess my biggest example would be Revolutionary Road. It's written by Richard Yates. It's like my favorite book of all time, probably. And it's about like a husband and wife, like crumbling marriage, 1950s. It has a lot of commentary on the social climate at the time where the story follows like a marriage falling apart after the husband and wife are trying to fight the system of um, gender norms, and their marriage falls apart because of it. And the book was incredibly done. And Sam Mendes, he does like 1917 and stuff, and he actually did the movie, and it was a very seamless adaptation, and he pretty much did like transcribe like from book to movie, but it's like when you have such excellent source material, like yeah, it's easy. Whereas like one of my other favorite books, The Chocolate War by my other favorite author, Robert Cormier, the movie adaptation was awful because that was a book that really shouldn't have been made into a movie. And I say that with love because, most of the story happened in prose. It wasn't really like dialogue or character action. And I think too, like that's something to take into consideration with a lot of these adaptations, because especially in like sci-fi and fantasy genres, is like that's when you run into like exposition dumping and like wide shots of like scenery and like a lot of that kind of visual porn. I guess the weird like wide shot, like all these insane visuals, and you feel almost like you're stuck building a story around it just because what's in the book that means it has to be made into the movie. And I think that's also up to like the director's discretion to decide how much of the book makes it into the movie. Because like to your credit, Eric, you also said that if people want more to dive deeper, they can just read the book. And I agree wholeheartedly. I don't think every little thing has to be woven into the movie, but I think enough should be woven in that it makes sense. Like, I think that's what Dune 2021 does really well with some of the details, that a lot of it comes up organically. Like the whole conflict of the Emperor's plan to destroy House Atreides just really comes up naturally through the movie, the sequence of events. Like they, when the House Atreides shows up on Arrakis and they start going through all the equipment that the Harkonnens left behind, they're like, the Duke comes to the conclusion that, oh my gosh, we were sabotaged by these people. We were set up to fail. Isn't that what happened? Whereas, like, in the first 11 minutes of Dune 1984, like, Paul, played by Kyle MacLachlan, makes that conclusion. He's like, this is probably a trap. And it's like, it doesn't feel very seamless to me. But, and same with, like, the whole Emperor's plan was, like, literally within the first 5 minutes of the movie, they just kind of spelled it out. I'm like, okay, so this is what I'm in for. But again, that's probably like a lot of studio fault, trying to jam as much book into the taking a 5-hour movie and condensing it down into like just over 2 hours. Like, that's probably a flaw on their end, but something definitely 2 movies could remedy. But fortunately, I'm just going to say I'm glad that we're going to be getting 2 movies officially. I checked, I followed Timothy Chalamet on Instagram and he posted about it, so therefore it must be true.
Just to clarify a few things, first of all, when I say that a movie may not make a great film adaptation, I'm not making fun of the book or saying it's a bad story
Right.
or anything like that. Like you said, Marie, not every book has to be a movie. There used to be a time before books were written with the intention of being made into movies. And some do, of course, and, it's not really even, if there's a bad movie based on a good book, everybody's experienced that. And a few of us have been lucky enough to experience good movies based on bad books, which is a funny experience. I just think Dune, with all of its different complexities and quite frankly, just eccentricities and oddities. I mean, when you tell the average person, if they aren't like into nerd culture or science fiction, oh, I just read this book, it's about people who they want this spice more than anything, and the spice allows them to fold space and travel anywhere in the universe, and there's giant worms that are connected to spice that they have to get around in the desert. I think most people would be like, what the fuck? And I think Dune, I'm not sure when it came out. I think it was during the psychedelics era, is my guess, just based on the general vibes I get.
It was 1965.
Thank you. So yeah, like I'm not saying anything about the book, which I haven't read, so I can't make any value judgments on when I say that.
Right. No, I'm sorry if I made it seem that way. No, that's not what I meant. I just mean in general, like, due to like complexity of source material, it can be hard to translate that to screen well.
Yeah, and that was ultimately where I'll say I as a viewer did not agree with the new interpretation, was that I don't think that the film conveys this world in any interesting or compelling way that makes me want to learn more. Like I said, I'm not going to sit here and like defend Lynch's version. He wouldn't do that if he was the guest on the episode, but unfortunately he's scheduled for episode next month. Allegedly. I think you can say anything with allegedly after and get away with it. But I was interested in the weird ass nonsensical world he presented. And a lot of that's just my taste. But a lot of this stuff presented in the newer movie to me, how I just summed it up earlier, and this is me basically committing a logical fallacy. I'm going to call myself out. But when I watch some movies, just like there's some people that, like, you think a certain band's douchey. Like, I think Red Hot Chili Peppers are a douchey band. I don't like their vibe. I don't know them. They could be cool guys, but that's the vibe I get from the music. I would not want to hang out with them personally. I'm not saying anything about Denis Villeneuve. I know nothing about him personally. But as a director, what I see is every shot of the film is constructed around the shot rather than the shot being constructed to convey the story. So even down to things like blocking and all that, it's all very meticulous. It's usually minimalistic, and it's very choreographed in a sense, where everybody's in an exact kind of almost static position. which you brought up before we record, I believe, Matthew Barney, Cremaster Cycle Marine. I don't think we were recording for that. And it has that kind of factor to it. But he mixes that with this kind of grounded realism. And that's a very tough thing to do. That's like magical realism, where it has to be both plausible as a living world, but yet, I don't have the proper word for it exactly, but you know what I'm saying. It looks like an art installation, people standing here and there, a fashion show or something.
Right.
But yet it's also supposed to look like this world where anything can happen. And in real life, people cough, they burp, they fart. There's people walking around during scenes. The world is alive. The literal world that we live in is alive. And I never got that vibe from this movie. You could say a similar thing with Blade Runner 2049. Well, I would say a similar thing, but there's counterpoints within that movie. There's scenes where there's a lot of people walking and things going on, and that world does feel lived in. It's not compatible with the original Blade Runner, in my opinion, which is fine. He's putting his own take on it and his own aesthetic choices that I didn't enjoy on their own merit, but I see how that world is believable, using his own catalog as an example. In this world, I never once felt like there was anything beneath the surface of the shot. And I felt like a lot of it was egotism in cinema form, where, like I said, so much of it felt like, rather than it being sums of a whole, it's really just like, this shot's going to look this way because this is going to be badass and all that. And that's fine. I like some directors that do that stuff. I'm not saying that I'm above it. A lot of these comparisons, like Fautour, you could say that about Zack Snyder. I love his movies, but they're goofy as hell. They are movies. But for me personally, it didn't work for me in making this world inviting to my tastes.
Yeah, that's the only person I know. Thank you.
Is somebody partying? Is somebody in like the night?
No, there's a carbon monoxide alarm going off in our building.
Oh,
and,
I'm sorry.
People
You need
calling
to
the
stop
fire
recording?
department. I don't fucking know. So, okay.
You okay? Oh.
I don't know what's going on. People knocked on our door. That never happens. So.
Oh, man. But,
You guys can keep talking and fucking do it. Do the podcast.
yeah, sure. Eric, did you have any thoughts on what's
I'm
up?
done.
Okay, cool. I was just gonna keep rambling or something, but I hear what you're saying, Todd, and I think that's what goes back to the whole like industrial cinema comment, where like the movie had a big budget, but it's in some aspects the ambition didn't match the budget, and I can see that being like a valid criticism of the movie. And for me personally, it's again, I still give it a 10. Like, I still very much was in love with the movie. I mean, it had like my top 3 things I look for in a movie, and I'm like, yes, it's a blockbuster. It is, and you know, and to some degree, I'm okay with that. You know, for me, I'm not always looking for like the high level, like super high standards. Like sometimes I can be fast and loose with standards, but all in all, I am looking forward to seeing like the next installment, whether it's going to be, you know, something, you know, hopefully better, and maybe it'll expand on some things, and maybe, you know, if you're willing to watch part 2, if you maybe you'll find something you like more about it.
Why
But for me, I
say that to me.
What?
I'm kidding.
No, you have to watch it.
I
Todd,
won't,
we've seen like 3 movies. We have to keep it. No, I'm kidding. You can do whatever you want, live your life. But man, I'm willing to see where the story goes. I'm willing to see if there's gonna be any more emotional hook. Like again, if it has my top 3, I'm cool with that.
Well, you know, a lot of it brings up this point that I heard about the Star Wars prequels, ironically. It was just funny because they're both very sandy movies. But it was by Rick Worley, who's a YouTuber that I enjoy. And he has kind of controversial opinions. He's got weird takes on stuff, but he's very articulate. I really like how he explains himself and his perspective on things. And one of the things that he said that really changed the way that I view movies, for the prequels especially and adaptations, he said, people were mad because they had these prequel ideas in their head of what the Clone Wars were and what Darth Vader was like as a young man and Obi-Wan when he was younger. And George Lucas failed to deliver those expectations for a lot of fans. And what Rick Worley said about it, he said, well, of course it's going to be different. You have the movie in your head, and you always will. But you're going to see George Lucas's vision, not yours. You're not paying to see your hopes and dreams on screen. You're going to see his. And you can like that or not like that. But I have adapted that perspective on, like, directors or, studios or whatever with this kind of thing where it's like, well, maybe this isn't what I want in a movie, but I'm not going to see what I want in a movie, despite my obvious conflicting self-interest with that. And a big thing for me is that at the end of the day, Villeneuve's vision is just not one that I'm personally prescribed to. It's not one that I wish to see on screen. And other people, of course, can. I'm not running in and taking copies of Arrival from anyone's house or anything at night.
Yeah, for sure.
But in terms of, people that I would go out with again, other directors, he's just not one for me. I just don't vibe with him.
Yeah, and no, that's cool. Like, I think it's interesting to see the experience that each one of us brings to, like, this movie, how Eric and I very much enjoy it. I mean, I think he and I enjoyed, like, different aspects of it, but all in all, it was enjoyable, and you have a very different experience. And it kind of reminds me of this when you're talking about the director's dream and everything, seeing someone else's interpretation to close out. So you guys have anything else? I wanted to share a quote Jodorowsky from
Maureen?
Yeah?
Hey, I'm sorry. Can you just repeat the last part you said? You just kind of cut out there.
Yeah, cool. I was just going to say to close out, unless you guys have anything else you want to add, I wanted to share a quote from Jodorowsky from his documentary on Jodorowsky's Dune. That kind of summarizes a little bit what you're talking about. He says, Dune is in the world like a dream, but dreams change the world also. And that's it, y'all. I'm done here.